Let's talk about Diablo 2.
The beast contained herein shall not be set free, not even by you.
In June of 2000, the San Francisco division of Blizzard Entertainment, Blizzard North, released one of the most influential isometric action RPGs of all time, Diablo 2, the sequel to 1994's groundbreaking title Diablo and its expansion Diablo Hellfire. Say what you want about the current state of Blizzard Entertainment. The publisher had a track record for putting out quality content by the time Diablo 2 came out. By 2000, Blizzard North had already released the first Diablo game, and the other developer, Blizzard Entertainment, had released Warcraft and Warcraft 2, Blackthorn, and The Lost Vikings. Blizzard Entertainment would go on to release Warcraft 3 and its expansion, Frozen Throne, and in 2004 they'd release World of Warcraft, which is still going strong to this day despite the dubious quality of the expansions post-2010. Games made in the 2000s by these two developers were childhood staples of mine, with Diablo 2 possibly being second to World of Warcraft in my lineup of most played games developed or published by Blizzard Entertainment. I'd always played the Necromancer, but sucked at RPGs at the time and wasn't aware you could stack skills, so I would always have to be carried by someone else who actually knew how to play the game. Well, now I'm good enough to know how to cheese my way through the game, so here it comes, a review of Diablo 2. Let's start with presentation. I've always held the stance that while graphics are important to a game's presentation, they are simply one factor in the overall quality of the game's aesthetic. Though the 2D graphics in Diablo 2 aren't that great, the dark fantasy art style is utterly captivating. I'm going to sound like I'm blinded by nostalgia here, but in my opinion, even though Diablo 3 has objectively better, fully 3D graphics, Diablo 2's presentation is superior due to the art style being much more appropriate for the game's themes of hopelessness, despair, and a solitary journey into a dangerous world. Well, solitary if you're like me and only play single player, that is. Diablo 3 just looks cartoonish, like a gory World of Warcraft. The music is also dark and ambient, with looping guitar riffs that accurately convey the tone of each area. From the spooky tones of the dark woods in Act 1, to the oppressive desert soundscapes of Act 2, to the almost mystical woodwind parts of Act 3, the soundtrack was perfectly engineered to match the tone and color palette of each region in the game. Of course, there is the matter of resolution. That's the elephant in the room here. The native resolution of this game is 600 by 800. That means if you're using a computer that's not 600 by 800 natively, it'll have a seizure resizing itself every time you launch the game and every time a cinematic starts. It's annoying, but you get used to it. That's why you can count the total number of pixels in this video. You may have heard pretty much every reviewer who talks about this game and pretty much every other game in the isometric action RPG genre say that it induces carpal tunnel. But I'd have to say that it really depends on the build you play. If you're a Summonmancer or Hammerdin, you won't experience this, but a class not based around using high damage spells or summon sparingly will require you to furiously click on the left or right mouse button like you're a recovering meth head at a museum dedicated to rock candy. The core gameplay loop consists of clicking on monsters to kill them with spells, or you could just hit them with swords if you're a barbarian. The other main elements of gameplay that revolve around this concept are getting way more loot than you can carry in your inventory screen, teleporting back to town every 2 minutes, and doing quests that are fairly easy to find and don't require an online guide. If you end up with too much gear, just town portal back and sell your shit. Simple stuff. However, things do get deeper once you get into the class system. There are 5 classes that are introduced in the vanilla version of the game, and 2 that were introduced in the expansion. The Amazon specializes in throwing spears and shooting bows. The Assassin throws gas and knives, and you can either specialize in laying down traps for enemies or using martial arts. The Necromancer is basically a sorcerer who can cast bone spells that do direct damage, but can also cover himself with armor and wall enemies in, blow up corpses to deal incredibly large amounts of damage, or resurrect corpses and summon golems to play the game for him. The Barbarian hits things with large objects and spins around, dealing massive damage with said large objects. The Paladin hits things with flying hammers. More on that later. The Sorceress magics things to death using magic. The Druid can turn himself into an animal, summon animals to fight for him, and cast elemental spells. I have played all of these classes at some point, but the ones I've played for this video were the Summonmancer and the Hammerdin. The Summonmancer is a necromancer whose main focus is to summon creatures to fight for him and pretty much destroy everything in their path. It gets really fucking boring. Don't play it if you're looking to actually play the game. The Hammerdin, which is a paladin that uses the Blessed Hammer, is pretty damn powerful and can be incredibly fun as well. It's hilarious to see demons that attempt to dodge your first set of hammers, but then end up getting hit by a stray hammer like 10 seconds later. It's also a very cheesy build, since these hammers can kill most normal enemies in one hit and most legendaries in a few hits. I do appreciate that every build, even the cheesy ones, still takes at least a moderate level of skill to use. For example, the Summonmancer requires that you keep monsters in your line of sight in order to cast curses on them. And you need to be good with making sure most enemies are next to corpses in order to explode these corpses to deal massive damage. Of course, you can use your skeletons and golem to kill everything, but corpse explosion is much faster. The Hammerdin's primary skill, Blessed Hammer, is also not a hammer that is thrown straight at enemies. Rather, it spirals outward and hits enemies in its path, then eventually fizzles out. At first, I was incredibly frustrated with the path of these hammers, especially since I unlocked the skill in the Maggot Lair, where everything is conveniently right in front of you, and every hammer that you throw will be blocked by a wall, considering 90% of this place is narrow corridors with enemies that just so happen to be in the hammer's blind spot. Once you get through the bullshit lair, you have to quarrel with the attack patterns of the hammers themselves in an open area. I swear, I thought whoever made the spell work like this was hammered themselves. Once you do get the hang of it, you'll be one-shotting demons and dabbing on legendary creatures and bosses in no time. Also, it's hilarious because hammers, to me, are the funniest type of weapon. I don't know, maybe it's just the Stockholm Syndrome the spell gave me talking, but hammers are definitely the apex of slapstick comedy. There are a lot of things in Diablo 2 that really grind my shit to a boil. The first would be the stamina bar. The stamina bar can consume a cavalcade of caramelized cocks. It's one of those things they removed in Diablo 3 that I have no problem with, because the stamina bar is just an unnecessary pain in the ass. I really don't like dropping everything and standing still to recharge my stamina or wasting valuable inventory space for stamina potions or valuable gear slots for stamina recovery. The vitality stat is linked to stamina, and most classes will be dumping points into vitality, but it's still very annoying. Speaking of precious inventory slots, you really don't have enough inventory space, and in my opinion, it really kills the pace of the game to have to run to town every 2 seconds to sell all your gear. And honestly, you're a special kind of degenerate if you're not picking up all the rare shiny objects and filling up your inventory in like 2 seconds in a dungeon. Also, when you die, your corpse stays where you died with all the equipment you were holding. I'd be more or less ambivalent about this if it weren't such a pain in the ass to reorganize all your potions and whatnot. You can exit the game and your corpse will spawn in town, but I wouldn't recommend that since it also respawns all the enemies in the dungeon and overworld, and takes away any portals you may have up. Also, there's just something romantic about you and your mercenary walking over the piles of freshly slaughtered demon corpses. I guess the obvious solution to this would be don't die, but I try not to be one of those people. Another set of issues I have with this game ties into the levels themselves. Act 1 is really good, as it takes you by the hand and shows you the ropes. It's a very guided experience. For example, take the Den of Evil, which is the very first quest in the game. You get a quest from Akara, go to the den and clear it out. In this quest, you'll be introduced to several gameplay concepts. The first would be finding the dungeon itself. In the game, pretty much every quest centers on going to a dungeon in a certain area and completing an objective there. This one basically introduces you to that concept. It tells you the name of the dungeon, the region it's located in, and what you're supposed to do in there. Almost every quest gives you this level of information, which is a good thing. Then, when you get into the dungeon, you're introduced to the concept of special enemies. This is where you will not only be fighting the generic red demons you've been stomping on the way to the dungeon, but also shamans that resurrects them. It pretty much lets you figure out that you need to kill the shamans first, so you aren't fighting the same demons over and over again. Then, at the end of the dungeon, you'll be faced with a legendary creature that has elemental abilities. These creatures are scattered throughout the world and are generally found at the end of dungeons, and are more difficult than the standard mobs you face. Their abilities are listed under their names. This one has Spectral Hit, which can deal roughly 66 to 100% elemental damage from any element in addition to the base physical damage. You will need to handle monsters such as these appropriately. Alright, I promised I'd talk about issues with these acts. Don't worry, here they come. Even though Act 1 is great, Act 2 is where things start to get fucky. There are a lot of poison enemies, which is pretty annoying, but I hate the beetles, especially John Lennon. I also hate the beetles that are found in Act 2, which deliver area of effect lightning damage when hit. If you can't avoid the lightning bolts, just do what I did and chug healing potions until the act is over. Unfortunately, the AI generally have the intelligence of a rock, which means that your merc won't get the same ideas. And it's a pain in the ass to give them potions every 2 seconds, so I just let them die if their armor can't absorb the blows. Also, the maggot lair is a thing as well. I've mentioned it earlier, but it's worth saying again, fuck that place. And finally, Duriel. The game is moderately challenging up to that point. Then you go into his boss area and get your ass handed to you by that final act boss on a silver platter. Act 3 is also pretty frustrating, but not as bad as Act 2. Everything is a drab and monotonous swampland, and there are these little douchebags who run around and are annoying to hit. They also poison you. Luckily, they can't escape the spinning hammers of justice. Mephisto is a great boss though. One of my favorites in the game, second to Baal, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. I really like Act 4, but it's very short. I don't really have anything else to say about the act itself. It's pretty solid, but it feels a bit rushed. The boss, the titular Diablo, is the final boss of the game, but he's really nothing to write home about. Act 5, on the other hand, is the best act in the entire game. It's the act that came with the expansion, Lord of Destruction. You're journeying to Mount Ariyat, home of the barbarians, to destroy the titular Lord of Destruction, Baal. Let's talk about Baal as a character for a second. Baal is honestly the only primary antagonist in the game with some level of personality, as Mephisto really only shows up for a few minutes and doesn't have much to say. And Diablo is in most of the cinematics, but his personality consists of brooding menacingly and journeying with some old guy. The first cutscene of Lord of Destruction shows Baal spouting off a one-liner and turning a brave guard into a meat slushie.
Well, it seems your terms are not acceptable.
It just shows how ruthless and sociopathic he is compared to the other prime evils who are more or less just there, doing evil for its own sake. There are also lots of optional dungeons in the form of hell portals that take you to areas similar to that of Act 4, which I found pretty nifty, especially since I could hardly get enough of Act 4's hellish landscapes. The genius with these portals is that the first one piqued my curiosity, and I ended up having a pretty good time and got some pretty decent gear for my troubles after I entered it. Also, there is one last point to note, which is the Ancients Trial. While the Ancients are a pretty easy boss fight overall, there is also an overhead view of the entire war zone, and I think that's pretty cool because it gives you a sense of accomplishment at the end of the act. Of course, after all that, there is the Baal fight at the end of Act 5. I definitely liked fighting him more than Diablo. Killing him was satisfying as well. The only thing I thought was silly was that I had to kill several waves of minions representative of each act, but whatever. Water under the bridge. Even though it's not as fun as bitching about things I hate in otherwise excellent games, I'm going to talk about other stuff that is good in this game. The first thing would be the map. It's a big screen-sized map of the dungeon or area you're in and shows all the crucial information, such as doors, quest objectives, valuable treasure chests, NPC locations, dungeon entrances and exits, the location of your corpse, and the locations of shrines that are close by. And all this information is not obtrusive, as the game can easily be played with the map always on due to the fact that it is very transparent. This is good for someone like me, who has the incredibly healthy attitude of being a control freak, who needs to know exactly where I am and where everything else is in relation to me. I do think that this kind of map would only really work in a game like this though, since it's isometric and you can pretty much see everything you need to on one screen. The voice acting is very convincing as well. You have characters such as Deckard Cain,
This is a great victory indeed, but many more battles await.
Tyrael.
I am impressed, mortal. You have overcome the greatest challenge this world has ever faced and defeated the last of the prime evils.
And Bale,
You've done exactly as you were meant to do.
who generally have weight and emotion behind their lines. The cinematics are very, well, cinematic, as Blizzard generally had great cinematics for that time.
As I watched, I became convinced that I was truly mad.
And yeah, I've pretty much said all I have to say. I didn't really get into the endgame content, but there are people who go into it much deeper than I can. I would 100% recommend buying this game, as it still holds up very well today, despite a few dated mechanics. You can buy it on Blizzard's website, unless you're boycotting anything made by Activision and Blizzard because of loot boxes or the surge of Overwatch Rule 34. If you do want to buy it, it's $20 for the game and the expansion. You don't even need the Battle.net launcher to download and play it, which I find to be pretty fetch. That's all on Diablo 2. Tune in next time when I attempt to draw the ire of several fanboys of a beloved 1998 PC classic. This is CreamyClaws, who is decidedly not a furry, signing off.